Jump right into it. Today, we're pleased to welcome Ray Joseph. Ray is a native Angelino. He lives in Hermosa Beach these days. He is a realtor and former tech executive who got his career started at Apple. I'll let him fill you in on those details. And I think it's going to be an interesting presentation and conversation because Ray's going to talk about an issue that we haven't really talked too much about, but that is becoming, I think, more and more salient as these YIMBY laws start really not only taking effect, but showing their impacts at the ground level. And Ray is going to talk about the impacts specifically on the residential real estate market based on his deep experience and expertise, and talk about how some of our worst fears are starting to come true in terms of impacts on sales, impacts on patterns of where people are looking and buying, and so forth. And I think this is going to become, I think today's talk is probably going to be the first, unfortunately, of many, because again, we are now starting to see those real downstream effects in real time affecting real people, real hardworking people who have, in many cases, saved for years and decades to realize the dream of home ownership, and now are seeing their options and their neighborhoods buffeted in negative ways by these laws, which, as we know, are only going to get worse. And, God help us when SB 79 kicks in June of next year. So with that, I will turn it over to Ray, and then we'll do a little Q&A and then wrap up with, as usual, a more general conversation. So Ray Joseph, take it away. Welcome to Livable, California.
Thank you very much. Yes, my first job out of college was at Apple in the architecture and real estate group, and until they kicked me out because I was too good with the computer and I had to go over to sales. But one of the things I learned there is one of the great things about owning property is you control the space. No one can take it away from you. And that's very important for commercial. Like for example, if you move, like I was at a tech company, we moved from one side of Palo Alto to the other side of Palo Alto. We lost 3 engineers because the commute was too long. And when you lose key people in an organization, that's a big deal. And so same thing for houses, you control the space. So if you look at what our country is basically founded on, the American dream was to own land. People came here to own land because in other countries, the kings owned it. You didn't own the land. Here, you own the land. Buying a house is the American dream. And people buy houses for all the same reasons. It's all stage of life. Start a family. The family got bigger, need a bigger house. You got a promotion, so you go to a nicer house. You move into better schools. You have to relocate. Oh, now I'm an empty nester. Let's downsize. All those sorts of reasons are all the same. And my dumb little expression is people don't buy houses, they buy lifestyles. They want a great neighborhood for the kids to play. They want good schools. So what makes good schools? Good parents, because parents follow up at home. And also when you're in a neighborhood with good schools, all the other kids have really good parents that are on top of their kids. As kids get older, we get less and less influence over them. Their peer group has more influence. And one day my son saw his friend wearing a Penn shirt. He goes, "Why are you wearing a Penn shirt?" He goes, "Well, my dad went to Penn. I wanted to go to Penn." Now is no longer if my kid was going to go to college, but what college is he going to go to, right? That's the advantage of being in a good community, is the peer influence is really good. My dumb philosophy, surround yourself with good people. People want yards for kids to play in. They want garages to build things, do projects. They want quiet streets where kids can ride bikes and play. That's one of the things I point out to people, when I'm showing them property. Hey, the kids can play on this street. Because kids want to ride, because no backyard's big enough for a, 10, 12-year-old, because they're running and stuff like that. And so they need a spot where they can throw the football, ride the bikes, do all that stuff. And so if you've got a quiet street, they can be out there playing. And so that's a big deal. You want good neighborhoods. And here's another perspective, how many companies were started in a garage or their home? Apple, Microsoft, Dell, Harley Davidson, Disney, HP, Mattel, Amazon, Nike, Facebook, Google. And there was a guy, NASA engineer, worked for JPL. He was trying to invent a more energy efficient refrigerator at home. He was in the pump of the refrigerator uses the most electricity. So at home, he's got this pump working and it's moving an amazing amount of fluid. And he's showing his wife, look at this, dear, look at this. What did he invent? Anyone? Any ideas? The super soaker. He invented that at home. He invented the super soaker. Rocket scientists invent super soaker. But all these great things come from the home, come from the garage, come from all these little things. And that's why neighborhoods and our homes are so important. You know, when people buy into a neighborhood, they expect it to stay about the same. Sure, yeah, someone's going to add some square footage to their house or remodel their house. Things will evolve a little bit over time, but you expect it to stay relatively the same. You definitely expect it to stay single family homes. And so when you look at realtors, they learn the neighborhoods, they learn the schools, they study, comparables for properties, but most realtors don't know even local zoning other than saying, oh, can you build a 2-story house and look out? Oh yeah, look at the neighbors, they're 2 stories. You can go 2 stories. They don't know the local zoning very well. What I learned in doing real estate was I learned what I call the building envelope. What's your front setback? What's your rear setback? Side setbacks? How high can you build? How many square footage? So I kind of learned the basics of what you could do. And that way I can educate my customers on what you could do. And more importantly, what your neighbor could do. Because at the beach where ocean views are important, you want to make sure that the guy to the west of you doesn't build up higher and block your view. So I learned enough to know, what the neighbors could do so that didn't affect your property values. So a really good realtor would know some of the local zoning, and they might know some of the difference between the single family zoning and the commercial zoning. They might know where you could build multifamily or you could build 2 units on a lot versus one. And they might know some of the very, very, very basics. Most have never seen a zoning map. They don't even know what a zoning map is. They don't know where the lines are in town, what separates one section from another section. Most don't even know the school boundary lines. And that's mostly important for elementary because each elementary school has its own boundary where the kids go to that school. And then when you go to the middle school, they all condense, and then the high schools as well. But most don't know that. They don't know, they don't know what you can build on the different zones, the number of units, height, setbacks, maximum square footage, open space requirements, parking, requirements, ADU laws, the difference between an ADU and a guest suite. I always tell people never ever build an ADU because then you can't reduce the number of units. Or if there's historic properties, that's just the local stuff, right? Sometimes county record, like especially in Hermosa Beach, the county records, if you look up a county record for a property, it would say it's in an R2 zone. But if you look at the zoning map, it's an R1 zone. So there's inconsistencies in granted in government records, but in all record keeping, there's always inconsistencies. But a lot of people don't know to check the two, and that there's differences between the two, and what to know there. And then you start throwing in, the state override of local zoning, and only a small number of realtors know this, and you don't learn it until it happens. Like I started finding out about all this stuff when I believe it was in Hermosa Beach. There was a church that was going to build all these high density units, And then I heard about that because, obviously the neighbors heard about that. And then some other realtors told me, and then I started finding out about that. And then I was on a Zoom call, and that's where I met Bill Brand and started learning about what is going on with all this stuff. Because at first you go like, oh, you can build an ADU, no big deal. Then you start finding out the impact of the ADU. And as in with everything that comes from Sacramento, you don't find out about it until it's way too late because you don't know what they've actually passed and everything. Um, so we find out about all these laws that truly impact us. Like the big one here is you can't reduce the number of units on a property. And we've seen places with triplexes and fourplexes on 1,300 square foot lots. I mean, what do you do with that? You can't do anything with that property. You can't reduce the number of units. And I mean, at best, you can get a single family house on that. It's about 1,800 square feet, 3-story. So those things are, ridiculous. But you don't find out until typically when you're in escrow and you start finding this stuff out. Like I sold a property and there was a retired guy living in it, lived off of just his Social Security, and he had $1 million. And they said he was low income. And you had to replace the units with other low income units, which was, catastrophic. And that killed the buyer pool for his property and really lost a lot of value. And so like the challenge is when do you find out? So that's if somebody was going to build the property, because they go down to the city and they ask questions. But if you're just going to buy it for yourself, you wouldn't know that unless you did the research. That's the problem. No one finds out until it's way too late. So a builder will go down to the building department, they'll ask questions, and then they'll be told what you can do, with the local zoning of what you can do. They'll find out you can't reduce the units, low income requirements, they can't combine lots, uh, all these different things, and all these things hurt property values. But they usually will tell you what's going on with that lot. And the challenge is they don't tell you what's going to happen next door. And that's when you run into some additional problems. Most find out, like when they send out notifications, they only send out notifications within 100 feet of a property. And there's a property 4 doors from me. I didn't get a notification that they were going to tear down and build. And it's 4 doors from me, because they only do it to 100 feet. And so that becomes big issues. Most aren't aware of, local zoning changes. Or for example, I just heard up in San Jose, you have to go all electric now. So if your gas range goes out, you can't buy another gas range and replace it. If your furnace goes out, you have to replace it with electric furnace. And let me tell you, running an electrical line ain't cheap and easy. You're ripping open walls, you're pulling all that stuff through. It's crazy. So all those kinds of impacts are when you're buying a property on the state, overlay, and most people don't know it. So you get a savvy agent, they know their town. What if I'm selling a property over Marina Del Rey? What are the laws up there? What are the things? The advantage of being savvy, I can ask, I know what questions to ask. Like I can go over to their building department, find out, what can you build on a property? What can't you do? But they're not going to tell you what's going to happen in the neighborhood. Like the zoning map should include where the overlays are for the housing element, right? And they should have an impact of where SB 79 is, and they should have, if they clearly can't put anywhere the bonus density or the density bonus, because that could be anywhere, or builder's remedy, all those kinds of things. They can't put that on a map because that can happen absolutely anywhere if the city's not in compliance. And so even the planning departments are trying to learn the impacts of all these laws, and it makes it incredibly, incredibly difficult. So like when people find out what happens, I mean, that there's massive apartment buildings going up next door and they're going to lose, sunlight, privacy, increased traffic, change the neighborhood character. And when we talked about it before, when I talked about it before, when people buy their houses with emotion, less with the dollar, right? They're not thinking, like a businessman. They're thinking like, what a great place to raise our kids. And all of a sudden, one of these big apartment buildings goes up. You've got no privacy in your backyard. We're having this issue in Manhattan Beach on the street of Oak, which backs up to Sepulveda. And we've got multiple 7-story apartment buildings going up. And people are going, our kids aren't going to be able to play in the backyard because what if construction materials fall and land on them? And I can tell you right now, the guys, they're doing a remodel next door to my house. There's junk on the side of my house all the time. There's falling off of that building. And they're going to have, loss of sunlight, increased traffic, lots of cars parked on the street. And the problem with cars parked on the street, you can't see a little kid coming out between cars, which makes it, unsafe. So the kids can no longer ride bikes, throw the ball in the street. There'll no longer be parking available to the residents. When they bought their houses, there was parking. And also you're changing, the impact of the community, because you're getting a different class of people moving in. So all these things change the reasons why people bought their houses. So I've never, like on Oak Avenue, I've never seen so many properties go up for sale on a single street before. Everybody started selling and getting out of there. And even multiple streets in, people were selling because of that. They were just going like, we don't want to be anywhere near that. And that was just from the housing element, where the city could say, we're going to put it on we're going to put it on PCH, right? Now with SB 79, that can go in the neighborhood, right? Because you can go a half mile in versus they didn't say, would have been a more pleasant thing if they said within a half mile along the major artery where the bus route is, instead of penetrating into the neighborhoods, but the builders don't want that. They want to be able to build wherever they want. So people are concerned about, so all the things that they bought that house for, which is the backyard where the kids could play, the quiet streets, all these things, all these emotional reasons, because they're buying a childhood for their kid, right, to be raised there. And all those things are being destroyed, with these massive apartment buildings and whatnot going in. And those things are pushing people out because it's taking away exactly why they bought those properties. And the problem is, like all things from Sacramento, you don't know until it's too late. They won't know until these apartment buildings start going up. And then, then they go like, oh, it's just over in that neighborhood, not our neighborhood. Well, you just wait, it's coming, right? Because they keep evolving this stuff over time. And that's the scary part. So most realtors don't know local zoning. They're only hearing a little bit about the state stuff. Now we're going to have to track transit and understand what's going on with transit systems. Because if development is based on transit systems, that's going to be heavily impacting real estate. So it's really scaring people. If you get someone, depends on how much the realtor knows. Now you got somebody moving in from out of area or out of state relocating here. What are they going to know? Right? All these things become the challenges going forward because they're going to buy into a neighborhood and not know about any of this stuff. And when I get notices from California Association of Realtors, they rarely include anything about these residential overlays that they're doing. Let's say, oh, you could build an ADU. You're like, okay, fine, no big deal. And then you find out that people are, converting their garages. Now there's less parking on the street. Or in San Diego, where they put in 15 units in the backyard, that absolutely destroyed a neighborhood overnight because there's no parking and it's cul-de-sac, and cul-de-sacs are super premium because there's no through traffic and kids can play. but they're taking all that stuff away. And you're buying a house with your heart, and you're buying a childhood. You're buying the network of all the neighbors in the area. Like there's a neighborhood here called the Tree Section in Manhattan Beach. Everybody in the Tree Section says they live in the best street. And for all the same, oh, we got great neighbors. We do block parties. We do this. We do that. All those things. But when these high density buildings go in, all that goes away. And people are starting to, see what's happening here, and it's scaring them. And so once you lose, so like down here, what made the South Bay schools really good is all the aerospace industries, because we had nothing but aerospace engineers down here. And what do? They go study, study, study. They're making their kids study. So that made our schools good. But when you change the character of the neighborhood, what's the impact on our schools? What's the impact on our neighborhoods? And then people start moving away. All those kinds of things. So those become the big issues that we really need to warn people. So once I saw that one project, then I started going on to the Our Neighborhood Voices weekly calls and started learning a lot more about what's going on, and it's scary. Because the Realtors Associations aren't teaching it to you, because they don't know what's going on either, and they don't want to get involved in it because it gets political. Then Sacramento comes after them. So it's groups like this is where you really learn what's going on, but the impact is devastating because people move away, and it's really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Well, thanks, Ray. This is again, this is on the ground stuff. And I think the most telling number and the most telling statistic, and this is according to the US Census Bureau, is that 83% of Californians live in single family or low density neighborhoods. And low density is defined as 9 units or fewer. So the widespread effect, and we all know that the YIMBY agenda is not creating affordable housing. So you're destroying the very things that people want, and everybody wants, and replacing it with things that virtually no one wants. And if you really dig into the numbers and you look at the 17, 18% of Californians who live in these dense urban type cores, it's overwhelmingly college students and young people who are just getting started in life, just getting started in their jobs or careers, and fully expect one day, probably in their 30s, like many people, like most people, to own a home. So these impacts affect absolutely almost everybody. There's a vanishingly small proportion of Californians who spend their entire lives living in dense urban apartments. And as the state gets more and more diverse, that affects more and more people from more and more different backgrounds. So, what Ray is describing is the tip of the iceberg, and we are only just beginning to see these impacts. And I think, unfortunately, there are going to have to be a few neighborhoods that really get hit hard for people to wake up and realize that this train is coming down the tracks at their neighborhood. And one last thought, and then we'll get to the Q&A, excuse me, is that the next big train is mid-cycle arena review. And I'm speculating here, but I think I'm on pretty solid ground given our experience. HCD is going to be looking for absolutely any excuse they can possibly come up with to decertify or challenge or otherwise alter these housing elements that every city, I think 98% of California cities have a certified housing element. Now, granted, many of them had to go kicking and screaming, but they did it. And then as soon as they did that, it's as if the state is punishing them for doing what they were obligated to do. They're punishing cities with SB 79, which throws housing elements into complete disarray. It's almost like a middle finger to all of these collectively tens of thousands of city representatives and officials who collectively spent, I don't know, millions of hours. If you think of every single city and every single individual who was involved, literally you're talking millions of hours of efforts. And then they come along and pass SB 79 and like, screw you guys. And then the next big hatchet that they're going to take, and this is the one we should all be really worried about because it can potentially pour kerosene on the situation that Ray describes, is mid-cycle arena. And then just lastly, I'd like to highlight, I think it's interesting, and Ray and I were talking yesterday, how little even real estate professional. I mean, if your realtor doesn't know to look for this stuff, what chance does the average home buyer have, much less the average working class or middle class home buyer? Maybe if you're a rich attorney in you know Bel Air, you have a chance, but then again, places like Bel Air never get affected anyway, so that's a bad example. But the implications touch almost every single Californian, and for these YIMBYs to stand out there and crow about how they're all about affordability and diversity and what's the workforce housing. I mean, the hypocrisy just reeks to high heaven. So